All right, friends, today is 16 laws, so passed through Congress that we absolutely have to know. We're going to go down the road. So let's start with 1789, the Judiciary Act. So this was helping to add structure to the Constitution and add structure to Article 3 of the Constitution that established federal court system and supremacy of the federal court system. And so it establishes that structure, including the Supreme Court, District Courts, Circuit Courts, and the method that we would go through if there were some sort of case brought to those. It gives the Supreme Court power to settle disputes between states and federal courts to review state laws, and this really helped strengthen again the Supreme Court when it decided it had the power of judicial review in the case of Marbury versus Madison, which is going to be a Supreme Court case we talk about later. All right, let's move on to Alien Sedition Act 1798. This is time period 3. This is John Adams' presidency. Our second president allows the president to deport foreigners, essentially, and made it a crime to criticize the federal government because he was a Federalist and the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, were criticizing him. So the Alien Act targeted immigrants, specifically French, because the Democratic Republicans were close to the French and the poorer people, the immigrants and the farmers, were voting Democratic Republican. So this was a political move to try and get those people out of the country. And the Sedition Act restricted speech and free press because Adams was really paranoid about what people thought about him. And all of this was heavily opposed by the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, who saw it as violation of the First Amendment, specifically the Sedition Acts. And so people kind of start to hate John Adams, and Jefferson will win the election of 1800 against John Adams, an incumbent, kind of because of this. All right, the Embargo Act, 1807, I've already talked about in a previous video. Thomas Jefferson is upset about the disputes between Britain and France. American ships were getting caught in the crosshairs, so it prohibited American ships from trading with foreign posts, all foreign posts. It was intended to be a political statement against Britain and France to avoid war, but it devastated the American economy, particularly New England, because they were merchants and shippers. So it was super unpopular. It was repealed 18 months later, and it just showed that embargo is not the way to go politically. The Indian Removal Act, 1830. This is Andrew Jackson, this time period 4. So it authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. So America at this point had possession of all of the eastern seaboard, all the way to the Mississippi River, and all of the Louisiana Purchase. And so the idea was move all of them from the east coast of the Mississippi River into that Louisiana Purchase territory. Thousands of Cherokee and Choctaw and other tribes died during the journey. We call that the Trail of Tears because the Bureau of Indian Affairs did not take good care of them in that forced location. And the hope was that it would open up that land in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia for white people. They were moved to Oklahoma territory, but we know in time period 6 they're going to be moved out even further or put on reservations. Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to determine whether or not they would allow slavery through this idea called popular sovereignty. It basically repealed the Missouri Compromise because those places were above the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise. It resulted in Bleeding Kansas, where there's this whole disaster in Kansas where Kansas has 2 capitals. One is pro-slavery, one is anti-slavery. We have Northerners flooding into Kansas to try and vote it to be anti-slavery. We have people from Missouri flooding into Kansas trying to make it be a slave state. And it's just considered a pre-Civil War to the actual Civil War. Just kind of shows that political compromise about slavery ain't gonna happen anymore. The Homestead Act, 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, it's basically offering 160 acres of free land to settlers who farm it and stay on it for 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, you get that deed. It encouraged westward expansion, it encouraged populating that frontier area. It did provide opportunities for many homesteaders gave up because it's really, really hard to do. It also like furthered the displacement, the pushing of natives off of land. But over 1 million homesteads were granted, and it kind of gave the federal government this like, we have power over the West ideas. That's going to lead to the Indian Wars that happen in time period 6. The Homestead Act is in time period 5. In time period 6, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. It was a major immigration law based on race. Prior immigration laws were more based on just general immigration or area of place that they're immigrating from. This one is like specifically barring Chinese laborers from entering the United States. And it showed this really anti-Asian sentiment that's happening in California, and on the western seaboard, which is pretty like relatively new to our country because the Transcontinental Railroad just now connected the east to the west. It severely limited Chinese immigration and rights for decades, and it just shows the beginning of, not the beginning, but an example of ethnic discrimination in the United States. Dawes Severalty Act is in time period 6. All that westward expansion stuff I was talking about earlier, this was, okay, first they got moved over for the Indian Removal Act, then they were put on reservations, and then finally reservations weren't even good enough. So many white settlers were pouring into these areas. So it wanted to assimilate Native Americans by taking their communal tribes and allotting them into several different land plots. That's why it's called the Severalty Act or the Allotment Act. And it promised to give them U.S. citizenship if they adopted civilized, like white lifestyles. Think like mom, dad, 2 kids living on a farm, that sort of thing. But the major impact of this was that the extra land that wasn't allotted was given to white people, sold to white settlers. And so it resulted in this big land loss for Native Americans and undermining their tribal, like communal ownership of land culture. And this was an attempt to assimilate or get them to adopt white culture. Okay, Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914. This is the Progressive Era, time period 7. The Clayton Antitrust Act like strengthened earlier, it was actually strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. But antitrust means anti-monopoly. So outlawing practices that stop competition, like price discrimination, mergers, these big companies that buy out other big companies or try and destroy smaller companies on the stock market and then gobble them up. It's kind of pro-union in a way because it's promoting the idea that unions can kind of help bring down monopolies. The act kind of hopes to regulate big business even further, which was one of the goals of the progressive movement. The Espionage Act of 1917, sometimes put with the Sedition Act, the Espionage and Sedition Act. This is during World War I against Germany. The espionage made it illegal to support America's enemies during wartime, to do anything in that way. It was used to silence some freedom of speech. It was used to silence some dissent, specifically in regards to Schenck versus the United States, which we'll get to in a later Supreme Court case video. So many people think that this violates the First Amendment, but the government argued at the time that it doesn't because it's helping to further the war effort, which is used for, to protect Americans. And actually, when the Patriot Act was passed in the early 2000s, they used this as an example as why free speech should be limited sometimes. Okay, Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This is a major immigration law. It's one of the first ones to limit immigration by quota. Quota means a set number based on nationality. So saying only a set number of these people from this country can come in. And this was in response to the first Red Scare after World War I, when Russia became communist. Everyone was like, oh, we don't want communism to infiltrate America. And so it just reflected that nativism and that fear of foreign influence and communism after World War I. It was a precursor to even stricter laws that happened in 1924 called the National Origins Act. that restricted the quota to 2% of what came into the country the year prior. So immigration is going to attempted to be like whittled down and whittled down. And these things won't be taken back until the 1960s with the Immigration Act of 1965. All right, Social Security Act is next. The Social Security Act was part of FDR's New Deal, trying to solve the issue of poverty being an issue for the elderly. It created a federal retirement pension system or an old age benefit system and even unemployment insurance. So like when you lose your job, the government will pay you a certain amount each month for a set time to while you prove you're looking for a new one. It was a response to the Great Depression and really aimed to provide a safety net for the elderly and for the unemployed so that the big issues of the Great Depression would not deepen even more and maybe never even happen again. And it's like one of the most enduring pieces of federal legislature ever. Like it is major. It is huge. It's a major government budget item to this day and helps so many people to this day. All right, Selective Service Act. There are many different Selective Service Acts. There is the Conscription Act in the Civil War. There's the Selective Service Act of 1917 during World War I. And then there's the Selective Service Act of 1940. But all of them basically say the same thing. Almost all of them happen prior to a war actually occurring, but Americans see the writing on the wall. For this one, it's Americans see the writing on the wall of what's happening in Europe. The war in Europe started in 1939, and before Pearl Harbor even happened in 1941, there was a peacetime draft, drafting men from age 21 to 35. Later on, that draft will be expanded from 18 to 26 to register for potential military service. Okay. Interstate Highway Act of 1956. This is Eisenhower, signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike. It authorized and funded the construction of miles, like 40,000 miles of interstate highways that are still around today. This was in the middle of the Cold War, so it was kind of justified as like a public defense thing. If we want to beat the Russians in the space race, beat the Russians in a military battle for building up arms, then we need to be connected as a country. And the interstate highway system does that. It transformed transportation, it transformed commerce, it transformed the military industry, military bases popping up everywhere. But it does have some like environmental issues and environmental stipulations. And one thing that people kind of make fun of America for overseas is that we don't have a high-speed rail system. We just have the interstate system, and that makes people purchase more cars, and that hurts the environment more than possibly building a high-speed rail system would. But that's neither here nor there. Let's do the Civil Rights Act. 1964. Landmark legislation outlawed segregation or discrimination based on race in public places. And it banned employment discrimination based on race. It was pushed through by Lyndon B. Johnson. It was kind of part of his Great Society, this and the Voting Rights Act. The Great Society movement, part of the Civil Rights movement, and it basically will overturn Jim Crow. Now, we already had Brown versus Board. We'll talk about that in a different video, but this kind of puts the teeth and the like federal legislation behind that Supreme Court case that segregation is not allowed and Jim Crow laws are not allowed. And finally, the Affordable Care Act of 2010. We lovingly know it as Obamacare. It wanted to expand healthcare access. It requires individuals to have health insurance, and it like stops health insurance companies from discriminating against people based on like if they previously had cancer or some heart issue or pregnancy. You're not allowed to not have coverage because of that. So it also created government-run healthcare and expanded Medicare and Medicaid. It was really, really debated because that's a lot of money. Republicans, conservatives really oppose that mandate that you have to have health insurance. They see that as government overreach. Well, Democrats kind of defended the goals of, well, don't we want to have our people healthy? So it's like a really big, significant healthcare reform, and it, in some people's eyes, moved America closer to the spectrum of having everyone on the same like government healthcare plan, like some nations like Canada have. So it's pretty controversial, but it is still around today. All right, that's all.